Well, thank you, Colin, and it's good to be back in the Institute. I'm not sure how many times I've been here as a speaker, a few times, but it's been about, I think, 17 years since my last occasion, which I think was when I was ambassador in South Africa. I appreciate this opportunity to go over some of my thoughts about Syria, because it's something which has been very much on everyone's mind in the last year or so, and particularly on mine, since it's a country to which I'm very attached, not just because of my writing and my experiences as a traveller there, but because of close association with many Syrian people, and I just feel very much for them in their present agony. So we do indeed face a dilemma about Syria, and that's what I wanted to explore tonight. But of course, our dilemma is nothing compared to what the people of Syria face. The dilemma comes about because I think neither the government nor the disparate elements of its opponents can win this conflict, certainly not cleanly or decisively or quickly. What began over a year ago as mass demonstrations by brave people in the southern city of Deraa, prepared to confront a regime that was ready to use violence on a large scale, has now changed to spread to other centres, and showing much less parochial concerns than were apparent in the events of March 2011. At that stage, in confronting the demonstrators in Deraa, and as you remember from the television coverage at the time, many of them were children. In fact, many of them were very young teenagers. The events in Deraa spread fairly rapidly to other centres, but it still showed fairly parochial concerns, because people were generally objecting to, on the basis of local issues, problems with the governor, problems about land allocation, problems about water supply for irrigated projects, etc. And it was only towards the end of the first month that you started to get the first cries of down with Bashar, and you get the first hints that the people were also convinced that the only way they could have all their problems addressed was to overturn the actual regime. Now, the regime's response at first was to make some concession to these demonstrators, and there were dismissals of governors that happened fairly regularly in response to the rolling wave of demonstrations as they moved north into the country. But most of this wasn't accompanied by any follow-through in terms of real reform. A few people were got rid of, but they were replaced by people who really weren't any better. So the contagion spread, at first to some of the major towns in the centre of the country, namely Homs and Hama, and also the rather interesting town of Jisr al-Shugur, which is a fairly small town on the Orontes. But it was in these places that you first started to get the real indications that what people were on about was to overturn the regime. And that's when the regime's already repressive response to demonstrations became much more radical, much more ruthless. Now, of course, the significance of these towns, Homs, Hama, and Jisr al-Shugur, is that they're also the places where 30 years ago, you had a sequence of events which most people have forgotten about these days, but which resulted in a great wave of protest actions, but more to the point of massacres from both sides between elements who were opposed to the government and those elements in the government who wanted to put down any Islamic sentiments among the population. So you've got a rolling series of events from 1978 to 1982, or sorry, 80 to 82, which virtually culminated in the spectacular repression of the Hama uprising in 82 and the bombardment of the historic centre of that city and its great mosque. These reprisals were led by Hafez al-Assad's brother, Rifat. Now this conflict, even though to some extent it's followed the initial pattern of the other events, is now a very different confrontation. Because it's instead of the popular demonstrations which marked the situation in Deraa, and then in the early stages further north, you now have a much more concerted element of armed uprising against the government. And it's very difficult now to say which parts of this, which part of the struggle against the government is based on democratic sentiments and which are trying to impose agendas which are equally ruthless as the government's. So I think that both the government and the opposition elements, and I'll go through some of these elements in a minute, will keep struggling on to, because neither of them are able to bring a result without massive violence. And both, of course, believe that this is a fight to the death. They believe that if they lose, their forces or even their whole communities will be annihilated. The Syrian regime, of course, has the forces and the manpower to keep going, perhaps indefinitely. But their response times are sometimes slow, and they clearly have difficulty in moving trusted units around the country in time to address challenges. On the opposition side, the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian Liberation Army have little capacity to deal telling blows against the government's forces. They're prepared to mount as many small-scale operations as they can to keep the regime on the hop, but they can't control a major population centre for long or deliver a critical blow against any symbolic regime target. Let's look for a moment at the rhetoric of this struggle. We begin, of course, with the picture we get through the media, which is operating more or less solely at the rhetorical level for the last year. And the picture is often confusing and very misleading. I can remember several ABC news broadcasts at 7 o'clock in the evening, for example, which have told us that things are about to reach a culmination. You know, that the opposition forces are marching on Damascus and that things are about to come to a resolution. Well, I think this is based on a total misreading of what's going on in the country. And although I don't accuse the media of being willfully uninformed, I think the fact is, because they're not allowed into the country, the level of misinformation is much higher than usual. But nevertheless, the fact is that governments around the world get sucked into simplistic pictures of the situation, simplistic scenarios. And it's been some months now since we've had the first United States call, for example, for Assad's removal, or calls by Australia, I think, at the beginning, initiated this process, for a reference of Bashar al Assad's crimes to be brought to the ICC. Now, of course, you can't say that these things aren't morally right, but what I want to pose tonight in several points in my presentation is to ask the question, are they really going to help us to get an outcome that's no worse than the present situation? I should say too that these simplistic scenarios are reinforced by the social media. The audiences, when these clips and voice reports, etc., are reported in the news, the audience can't see the wood for the trees in the conflict. The real dimensions of the conflict are obscured. And this, of course, encourages knee-jerk reactions to what is perceived to be going on. Now, of course, thankfully, the catch-all description of the Arab Spring, which was common in 2011, largely seems to have died. But there is still a tendency to see events in Syria through the same idealized optic as we looked at events in Tahrir Square or Benghazi. Of course, it has to be admitted this is all made worse by the Syrian censorship restrictions, which keep most journalists out, except in what the regime hopes will be controlled circumstances. But I think that the high-risk adventures by some media reporters who got into Syria are only giving us a very small segment of the story. So why isn't Syria another Tunisia, or an Egypt, or a Libya, or a Bahrain, or a Yemen? I'd make the point, first of all, that Syria is a serious national entity. It has long-standing traditions of a tolerant and multi-confessional society. Its modern answer to this tradition has been a secular-based state. And while the state ideology encouraged under Baathism, the official doctrine of the regime, is still officially the guiding principle, in fact, of course, it is largely a dead letter, and few citizens of the country could explain what it means in practice. However, Baathism has left an attachment to a state structure which gives rights to minorities. It's just that some privileged members of one minority, which run the country, have more rights than the others, even the majority in the country. It, of course, has a tradition of an urban-based society with a deep, continuous history. Very few outside the Arab world appreciate the depth of creativity and tolerance that has marked Syrian society over many centuries. But in recent years, its weakness has been economic development, which lagged badly under the Ottomans, who did little for their provinces but exploited them or kept things ticking over in the society to enable the annual Hajj to go through Syria on its way to Mecca and Medina. In recent years, Baathism took on a socialist colouring, but without much fervour to go with it, with the doctrine. Still, however, the economy suffered from excessive state control, and only in the last 2 decades have the traditional energies of the urban trading classes been tapped again. But Syria, of course, has played a pivotal position across most historical eras of the last 1500 years. In spite of the setbacks over recent centuries, Syrians remain still conscious of the historically significant roles their society has played. For example, in medieval thought and science, as a rallying point of resistance to the Crusades, and in assimilating the minority rulers of the Mamluk and Ottoman eras into the best traditions of a wider Arab and Islamic world. So this continuing thread has been running through Syrian history, even when they weren't themselves in control of their own political destiny. We also shouldn't forget that many aspects of Syrian society deserve praise. This reflects this sophisticated urban-based tradition which has developed over millennia. Let's take 2 examples. For example, it was Damascus that brought Islam into the world, into a wider world, and gave it an urban and perhaps more tolerant dimension. Even earlier, just as Damascus gave St. Paul the notion that non-Jews as well as Jews could be followers of Christ, the city, several hundred years later, gave to the early Islamic rulers the notion that they should treat not just non-Muslims as a concept. They should treat non-Muslims not just as conquered people, but with rights and with an essential role in keeping the state together. And there are not many world conquests that were as bloodless as the Arab conquest of 636. Let's first just look quickly at the geography of the country.
Just press the down button.
Right.
No, hold on.
No, I think I've upset it. Okay. No, I've got that. Okay. First, a quick look at the country in terms of geography and ethnography and its religious communities. You'll see I've made a feeble attempt on this map to mark some of the mountainous areas of the country, and you'll see that there are very few of them. It has really no natural borders around its frontiers, to mark its frontiers. And in historical terms, it's a corridor, not a citadel, from which you could protect, with mountainous or river frontiers that could protect it from outside invaders. But the fact is, to control the Middle East, you need to pass through Syria. Second point I'd make is that Syria is a constellation of minorities. At the internal level too, Syria is on every fault line that runs through the Middle East, and has attracted populations which have come from that involvement with most other parts of the region. Most of these conflicts have left their residue in Syria, And Syria's tolerance towards refugees going back to the Middle Ages is quite remarkable. We only have to remember the Palestinians who fled the Crusaders after 1099, the Kurds who've come into Syria, particularly in the last century, the Cretan Muslims who fled Christian control of Crete in the early part of last century, and the Armenians who fled the genocide in Turkey in 1915. And not, of course, to forget the 1 million or so Iraqis who've taken refuge in Syria in recent years. So here, Syria has been very deeply involved in the historic tug of war between various elements in the region, and in particular between the Shia and Sunni traditions of Islam. Syria was the first real front line. In the early 12th century, it was in Aleppo in northern Syria where Sunni orthodoxy first took a stand in a major population centre that had been largely influenced by Shiism from the east. In the 1160s, Saladin was sent from Damascus to Cairo by Nur ad-Din to turn back the tide again in Egypt. He restored the supremacy of the Sunni Caliph based in Baghdad. And from there, Sunnism was resurgent in North Africa, which today, of course, is still largely Sunni. What, of course, outsiders don't appreciate is exactly what Arabs don't forget themselves. And the Arabs, particularly in Syria, have not got around to deconstructing history to make it a meaningless battle. It's in their blood, through their families, through the readings of the Quran and Hadith, through their church traditions, and even through popular TV series or films. Today, of course, most Syrian Muslims remain Sunni, but the regime has sought to advantage the communities favourable to the Shiite tradition in Iran. This has aroused great resentment among the Sunni majority. The regime has used ruthless means to keep the country together. The model embedded in the country by Hafez al-Assad since the 70s centred on a strong authority figure whose numerous intelligence and security forces were prepared to use all means to keep the state in the president's and his community's hands. From the menus of principles enshrined in Baathism, the Hafez al-Assad regime preserves some that deserve praise: a high level of education, secular-based principles to protect the position of minorities, and the development of infrastructure. Above all, he retained a strong hand which would keep the tiller steady even in situations of extreme confrontation, externally or from threats within. This meant, too, that the hand could steer a fresh course when the old options were discredited. Somehow or other, many of the traditional Sunni values survived two conflicts with Israel, the Muslim Brotherhood-inspired rebellion of 1980 to 82, an ill-advised attempt to outstay its welcome in Lebanon during that country's civil war, and the economic mismanagement. There were too many nationalizations, too many attempts, for example, to straitjacket agriculture. But when Hafez died in 2000 and his son Bashar succeeded, it seemed possible that a more worldly wise member of the new generation could make the adjustments to keep the formula going into the 20th century. It worked for a while, but Bashar lacked real credibility in balancing reform and authority, relied too heavily on family authority figures, for example his younger brother Maher, or his sister Rutaina and her husband Asad Shawkat, etc. And he relied too much on the soft, fudgy image in the outside world. It was a real winner in Vanity Fair, of the deft reformer that Bashar and his wife Asma sought to cultivate. A stronger ruler would have exploited the unrest of early 2011 to push the reform agenda he himself had foreshadowed, but had never seemed to be able to implement. Now, I've just put up the last slide here, which shows some of these main centres which I'll be mentioning as centres of disaffection and the government's response against the population. And you'll notice that there are the two main towns of Aleppo and Damascus, which are hopefully outlined in green, are not really part of this picture on a consistent basis. But it's the towns of central Syria, particularly those along the Orontes Valley, which are very much the target of this action. After Hafez al-Assad forces, led by his brother, regained control in Hama in 1982, the shock value of the disastrous bombardment of the town was exploited. But so too was the town subsequently showered with new development by Hafez's regime. The old city, now largely gone, began to vanish in a forest of vast apartment estates. Though recent events have indicated that Hama has remained a hotbed of opposition to the regime, but it stayed quiet for a good 3 decades. But Bashar's response to events in Deraa, on a much less ruthless scale, signaled simultaneously pliability and inflexibility. Both the regime hardliners and the reformers read the negative parts of the message. The regime forces simply overruled the president when their security interests were at stake. And so Bashar professed in that extraordinary interview with Barbara Walters that he, as Commander-in-Chief, could not be expected to carry responsibility for what his forces got up to. So what choices do we face now? It seems to me that the international community has a choice of 3 responses. Turn a blind eye, as the world largely did in 1980 to 82. Second, make grand gestures, let our indignation rule our brains, with little thought for the consequences, and possibly make things a lot worse by unleashing a motley series of groups, including murderous and dangerous elements, as we saw in Iraq in 2003 onwards. Or third, express our indignation clearly through international actions, sanctions, Arab League or UN collaboration on ceasefire attempts, etc. In the third framework, the hope would be that in the end, this international action will help shorten a conflict that seems bound to last indefinitely. It would rely on the cumulative effect of sanctions on the economy and prizing the business community away from the regime. Or it could rely on possibly convincing the forces that surround Bashar that a true path back towards some form of reconciliation can only be realised by putting forward another leadership figure to break the nexus. So let's just look a bit more closely about the dynamics of these conflict groups. The first is the Syrian National Council, headed by Burhan Ghaliun, who's a nominal leader who proposes a modern civil and democratic state, but his membership is heavily influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood. It's largely based in Turkey, but it's marked by a split over the level of support it should be giving to the armed opposition, and has only nominal participation by elements within Syria. It's variously recognised by 7 UN member states, including as, quote, dialogue partners, France, US and UK, but only Libya gives full state recognition. And the SNC itself doesn't claim to be a government in exile. Australia, by the way, has informally met with the SNC at the level of Foreign Minister Rudd. The second is the Free Syrian Army, said to be mainly defectors, although this is not clear, and certainly externally coordinated with its headquarters in Antioch in Turkey. It's affiliated to the SNC, so is also Turkey-based, and is headed by Colonel Riyad al-Assad, no relation by the way, and claims to have 37 battalions. It's vaguely jihadist, at least one of the battalions boasts an al-qa'eda affiliation. It has active Gulf support, but is largely able to deploy in the areas of the Orontes Valley and in the towns of Homs and Hama. But some of its actions, including ambushes, not just of military vehicles, but of Alawi civilians in these areas, amount to sectarian reprisals and has been criticised quite rightly by Human Rights Watch. The third element is the Syrian Liberation Army, much less important. It's internal, but loosely organised, and is mostly armed civilians and very much focused on the area of Idlib, which is on your map up there near the top. It claims 32,000 fighters, but usually rally only around local leaders. There are many other localized or ideological elements that make the violence worse on both sides. Salafists, or extreme believers in Islamic order, ex-fighters coming back from Iraq, clans controlling the smuggling routes into Lebanon and Turkey. All these believe their survival as interest groups are at stake too. And there are, of course, elements loosely affiliated to the regime of Syria itself. Security units with loose agendas, these sharpshooters you see in clips firing on demonstrators, and with a license to do whatever it takes, as well as the slightly more regulated Shabia, or the locally hired thugs raised by local party and intelligence bosses. In spite of attempts to represent the SNC as a Libyan-style alternative then, there is nothing nice about these entities. Many have unsavory links, and this is not Tahrir Square. This is a very unstable mixture. We also shouldn't forget that a proportion of the population support Bashar, though clearly most wouldn't agree with the means the regime is adopting. Looking quickly now at outside forces.
Yeah.
Okay. The media coverage, I think, has ignored another dimension of this conflict, which has overturned decades of givens. The tradition of not laundering Arab affairs in public has meant that public statements by the Arab League have rarely criticised fellow states. But in response to Syria, this time the gloves are certainly off. The Arab world has been long fed up with Syria's dalliance with Iran and its professed exploitation of the Hezbollah campaign in southern Lebanon to provide Shia Iran with anti-Israeli credentials. But to suspend Syria from the League is an extraordinary step, perhaps little appreciated in the outside world. Largely Sunni Arab states have long been exasperated with Syria, but supporting this step has no precedent over the last 50 or so years. It's hard to appreciate from Australia just how profound this overturning of Arab solidarity has been. It explains the vehemence of responses in the Gulf, especially in Qatar and Riyadh, with some states even prepared to back an armed rebellion against a fellow Arab government. The fact that the Arab League has backed firm action has also explained the almost equally extraordinary step by which virtually the entire UN membership and the less unanimous voice of the Security Council has been prepared to condemn the violence with which the regime in Syria has sought to address the situation. Clearly, the violence unleashed by the regime has only served to make things worse. If it was professing as early as March 2011 to be countering a violent campaign by outside funded forces, it has simply ended up 14 months later with a conflict which is now largely carried by those very forces, and which in some parts of the country, particularly in those areas I've shaded there in the central Orontes Valley area, which are on the interface between the Alawi Mountains on the coastal side and the Sunni majority towns in the interior. The disaffection in this part of the country and the conflict between armed groups has brought normal life to a halt. I won't go into the role of Russia, China and Iran. I think they certainly can be said to be the only friends that Syria now has, but I wouldn't be too sure about the extent to which their friendship is entirely uncritical. Even these three states have recognised that if the Syrian regime does have a problem on its hands, it is possibly going about addressing it in an undisciplined and excessively ruthless way. So, in this civil war, in this shifting so-called civil war, what should we be doing? Economic and symbolic sanctions are, in my view, right. Of course people say they don't work. They expect when you introduce them on Thursday, they'll have had their results by Monday. But from my experience, they do work. It just takes time, and of course, people do suffer. In Syria's case, the economy, in any event, is almost in freefall. Some say the country's gross national product is halved, the pound has certainly fallen by 50% in a year, and the regime is friendless for most purposes. But if it loses the support of the Syrian traders of the big cities, it could face a fatal situation. Now, the UN Observers Force, of course, has been introduced into this difficult environment. And of course, I should emphasize, and we had an interesting discussion with some of the interns before this, which we looked at the challenge facing the Observer Force. But they're not, we often don't necessarily make a distinction between a ceasefire force and an observer force. We don't actually have a formal peace agreement to supervise. So what we're talking about in the case of the framework set up by Kofi Annan is very much an observer force which, because of the political geography of the confrontation in Syria, which is extremely complicated, the observer force has to be right in among the conflict. But I think there are certainly problems, but it's certainly simply worth persisting. And I'm impressed by the slow and methodical way in which the UN under UN forces under Kofi Annan has been going about unpicking some of the problems as it tries to embed its personnel. But the international community and the Arab League will have to help Syria work through its problems, not just bluster away without understanding its dynamics. And in particular, if Australia is to be a Security Council member in 2013, it will have to play a more nuanced role than it has so far. This, of course, is exactly the sort of problem before the Council which Australia is ill-prepared to grapple with. There have been efforts to focus international action through the Friends of Syria. The Syrian government has ridiculed this attempt to emulate the Libyan example by setting up its own Friends of Syria website. So if you Google Friends of Syria, you get the government site, not the international community recognised one. Of course, it's ironic that Australia is a member of this group of friends. It reflects very much Kevin Rudd's rush of blood to the head in Cairo and Libya, and harks back, of course, to the days of symbolic posturing in the days of Herbert v. Elliott. But it's especially ironic for Australia since we didn't even bother to have an embassy in Damascus since it was closed in the year 2000. So I think there's little point in these jumping up and down responses that express frustration and outrage, but don't steer events to a more favourable outcome. There's been too much moral posturing driving policy in the last decade. The 2003 war in Iraq was an example, and as is Israel's blustering responses to the supposed Iranian nuclear program, even now questioned by some of the recently retired leadership from the intelligence and Israel Defense Force organizations. In essence, it's no use carrying a big stick unless you really are prepared to use it, since bluster has failed now too many times. There are huge risks in militarizing this conflict further, or to see it simply as an emblematic struggle to roll back Iranian influence in the Sunni heartland, as some Gulf states are now doing. Our best hope is for a less than worse outcome in Syria, one that has a managed transition. I doubt the outside world can manage it itself. Only the Syrians can do that. But we can help with action to complement them. Just simply pushing Bashar over a cliff is not a managed outcome, since we have no idea who will emerge behind him. And we've seen that in the many likely candidates, many are potentially worse. A more unfavourable outcome would be a less unfavourable outcome would be a move within the armed forces to find a fresh leadership figure who could perhaps serve to rally both the Alawi and Sunni elements in the army and security services, and assure both communities of an outcome that would not be a much worse bloodbath than what we have now. Having UN Arab League observers is a big plus. Any resolution will have to involve a clean-up of the Syrian political security system. Now, I'll quote now the views in the Guardian earlier or earlier last month, by Patrick Seal, who's one of the longest standing British observers of events in Syria. He's been writing on the subject since the 1970s and has kept very closely in touch with what's happening there. He says that the President will need to purge some violent men in his security services and set in train a sincere process of reconciliation. This might be a further task for unarmed. Seal went on to point out that a new Syrian political system would require power and perks to be more equitably distributed and would have to involve participation by the Muslim Brotherhood and the more radical Islamist currents. Simply to hope that by pushing Bashar out or dragging him before the ICC would unleash a new wave of democracy in the Middle East. Remember the immortal words of Condoleezza Rice about the birth pangs of the new Middle East a few years ago. To return to this thinking is simply to invite again the folly that the neocons wished upon us with the adventure in Iraq. Ultimately, this is up to the Syrian people to resolve. It's not for others to imagine on their behalf. Of course, the democratic movement has shown enormous courage, and I think we have only a fragmentary appreciation of how much the people of Syria have been staking so much on their involvement in these demonstrations compared to, say, their environment in Tahrir Square, where the chances of being mown down by snipers or by armed elements were relatively marginal. But of course, we also have to admit, or have to acknowledge that in recent months, the confrontation has been overtaken by armed fighters whose motives are much less easy to discern than those of the democratic protesters. What could we look for in terms of outcomes? Again, I'll quote Patrick Seal. Whatever he does, Assad will not satisfy his die-hard enemies. They want his head. But his reforms will need to be a good deal bolder if he is to satisfy even moderate opinion, which, while wanting to protect Syria from the destruction, chaos and uncertainties of civil war, will still want a radically different political system put in place. Any such new system will need to be free from the suffocating political controls of the past, free from police brutality, and free from crony capitalism. The situation may take at least another year to resolve. Even if Bashar survives, he will be a crippled leader with little credibility in the Arab or wider world, though probably not entirely forsaken by Russia or Iran. The economy will be in terrible state, and a very different Syria might emerge. It'll be one where it'll be very difficult to go back to the status quo ante. Certainly the fundamental virtues of Syrian society have been tested and in some respects reinforced. But the darker forces that lurk in the neighbourhood have been given a more prominent role. Where have these armed elements come from? Who is funding them up to now? We don't know how many are Salafists, some returned from Iraq, where their mischief was originally encouraged, of course, ironically, by the Syrian security forces. The Syrian opposition forces don't give us much encouragement. Now, of course, it is possible to make a comeback. Look at Lebanon, which in the first years of its recovery after 15 years of civil war, made an impressive comeback in the 1990s, though it's still fragile today after Hariri's assassination. One interesting point to consider, I think, has been the lack of a running commentary on Syria from Israel. Many might assume that as it professes to be the Middle East's only fully fledged democracy, Israel would welcome democratic neighbours. Though I think you might have to ask some of the almost 50% of the population under Israeli control whether they agree with the definition of democracy. In any event, the Egyptian tumult has been unkind to Israel's interests in Egypt. And there's been barely a peep out of Jerusalem on what is happening in Syria. As far as I know, the Israelis have not joined the neocon bandwagon in the US, calling for further militarization of the conflict. The fact is that Israel enjoyed an enmity with Syria that it had the measure of, even respected in some ways. And there's a very interesting article last month by one Yosef Podansky, which was widely publicized at the time, pointing out that the West is facilitating an anti-Western or pro-al-qa'eda solution in Syria. The interesting thing, of course, is that Bodansky is with the International Strategic Studies Association, a conservative think tank in Washington. The fact is that no democratic process is going to yield a more favourable attitude to Israel among its neighbours unless and until all the disputes over occupation are resolved. On the Sunni versus Shia dimensions, Iran's ambitions in the area are real, but they can be countered by other more peaceful means, not by offering up the Syrian people as a new battleground. If I can conclude on a personal note, in my service I saw 3 civil wars. They're very unpleasant things, in particular because nobody controls their dynamics. And in particular because outside forces usually make them worse, no matter how high-handed, no matter how high-minded the sentiments of the outside parties might be. Syria is certainly the most complex compared to these situations in terms of causes, ethnic and religious affiliations, and the capacity for outside interventions, given its location. Only one of my civil wars, the one in Bangladesh, was resolved by outside forces, but that was an exception due to its geographical isolation. Some have fizzled out because opponents just got tired of fighting a no-win war. Biafra and Lebanon are good examples. I have no doubt that international moral and to some extent material support for Ojukwu in Biafra helped that conflict spin out 2 years longer than it needed before resolution. So the lessons of civil wars, in my view, are that we should reinforce our support for international norms, but otherwise stay out. We don't have answers to everything, and we shouldn't pretend we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. And you proved there, I think, in that address, the devil is in the detail. And you did what I hoped you would do, which is to show that some of the reporting that we've had in the media is just not sufficient to govern the complexities of the situation. So thank you very much indeed.
As far as the outside world is concerned, I think they've been the most prominent voices in favour of Bashar. I mean, there are other communities who would have the same opinion, but to some extent. But I think the Christians have been more vocal on the subject. I wouldn't say that all Christians share that view. There are, some Christians among the demonstrators in the early days, but many Christians would come from the point of view that Bashar and Hafez before him didn't do a bad job on protecting the position of minorities in Syria. What he didn't do a good job on was protecting the interests of the majority. It's been pointed to, certainly by the Americans have been reasonably vocal on it. They seem to be referring to members of the, what do you call that group in Tehran supporting the president?
Revolutionary Guard.
Revolutionary Guards, yes. Who are expert in electronic monitoring, etc. That's possible, but I would have thought that the Syrians had a reasonable range of expertise on this subject. But it's possible they call for reinforcements from Iran. I just don't know. But it wouldn't be surprising. But whether that's a large element in sustaining the conflict, I very much doubt. Well, they're all good points. I think the big lesson from Iraq is that the Americans walked in there without thinking about any of these questions. And we don't know yet what the final outcome will be in terms of the consequences of that conflict. But I would think that a greater deal of Iranian penetration, and of course we already have a much stronger role for the Shiite community in Iraq, has been the result. I think the Iranians might like to transpose that to Syria, but of course there's a slight problem that 70% of the population is Sunni, and there's virtually no true Shiites in Syria, only a very small community. So the Gulf states by trying to fend off a resurgent Shiite influence by a Sunni resurgent influence, I think is quite obvious. If it's a Sunni influence on the fundamentalist variety like al-qa'eda. But what I tried to draw attention to in the early part of the talk was to point out that the mainstream tradition in Syria has been very middle of the road. That's where the traditional sentiment is lain. You didn't have that many extremist elements. It was more a society based on the traditions of the Quran and the Hadith and not of extremist interpretations of it. And the extremists, well, I wouldn't say extremists necessarily, but some of the smaller communities which were entertaining doctrines that the Sunnis couldn't support went off to live in the more remote areas of the country, and that's why you find the Alawis in the mountains and the Druze down the south and the Ismailis in the central desert. So Syria has always had a way of coming back to the mainstream of Islam, and I hope that will be the trend which survives this crisis.